In this short video I'm going to be talking about existentialism and other philosophers. The aim is just to give you a bit of context so you can see, firstly, who might have influenced existentialism, and also whose philosophy existentialism might have influenced after Kierkegaard and Sartre. Also we could think about philosophers who might be opposed to existentialism. This might, by looking at other philosophers, hopefully it'll give us a richer understanding of Kierkegaard and Sartre themselves. The person to begin with really is Jesus, particularly for Kierkegaard, because remember, Kierkegaard, though not a philosopher as such, had a big influence on Kierkegaard. Jesus taught using a very indirect method, very much like Kierkegaard. He taught in parables, and for Kierkegaard, the fact that in one person we have both a human nature and a divine nature, what we call the incarnation, is very much central to his faith. This is something that cannot be proven by reason, and something you have to commit to either way. It's not something you can grasp rationally. So this is for Kierkegaard very central. Thomas Aquinas is very important, if only because existentialism is very much against the ideas of Thomas Aquinas. In the Middle Ages, 1225 to 1274, well known for arguments like the cosmological argument. Kierkegaard, as a fideist, obviously would be opposed to the whole method of trying to prove the existence of God. Kierkegaard felt that however much evidence you found or arguments you put forward, there would always be more doubt, there would always be further you could go, so you'd end up never making a decision. Kierkegaard rejects attempts to prove the existence of God. In terms of morality, existentialism is also against Aquinas. Aquinas believed in a natural law created by God within us. That is a human essence, really, and we've seen how Sartre and Kierkegaard are very opposed to the idea of a human essence. Immanuel Kant is a significant philosopher in the 18th century. Kant argued that religion should be within the limits of reason. He thought that our reason can't really take us so far as to understand the nature of God. And this is something that Kierkegaard, who was writing a little bit after Kant, would certainly agree with. So existentialism would to some degree agree with Kant. However, in terms of ethics, they would disagree also, because Kant did believe that humans have absolute duties based on reason. He's a deontological thinker, and we've seen that existentialism does not go along with absolute duties in ethics. William James is a philosopher that's worth looking at. He was certainly, we think he was influenced by Kierkegaard, because he argued that religion is belief in God, faith is not so much about reason. For him it was about emotion. He talked about the will to believe. He said sometimes, you've got to make a decision. You can't put off making a decision forever, and we should trust sometimes what he calls the passional nature within us. And he was very opposed to evidentialists or rationalists like Clifford. And William James was certainly influenced by Kierkegaard's idea of the leap of faith. William James would be what we might call a fideist philosopher, very much emphasising the importance of faith. Karl Marx was an important thinker. He talked about the class struggle, revolution. He talked very much in terms of historical processes. He was a bit of a determinist. He didn't think that the individual was very free to do their own thing. We're very much dictated to by our place in history, and to that degree Kierkegaard was against Marx, really. But when you're evaluating Kierkegaard and Sartre, you could certainly consider Marx's view that we're not that free to overcome our social and economic situation. So Marx also would be critical of existentialists, because There's too much talk and not enough action. He really wanted to change society. So slightly different views there. Though it's worth pointing out that Sartre did become a Marxist very later in his life. We've talked about Kierkegaard already. Two famous books, obviously, Either Or and Fear and Trembling. Nietzsche is interesting. Nietzsche, writing a similar time to Kierkegaard, had a big influence on Sartre as well as Kierkegaard. Famous for saying God is dead and we have killed him. He talked about the idea of God seemed to have died a death in Europe in the 19th century. Now, for him, this was a good thing in a way, because he thought that for him morality was not about rules or duties. It was all about affirming life and being free and autonomous, or in control of yourself. Some of Nietzsche's ideas would certainly have been an influence on Sartre. Remember, Sartre says if God is dead, anything is permitted. Clear echoes of Nietzsche there. Worth finding out more about Nietzsche, I think. We've seen Rudolf Bultmann, certainly, in the 20th century, wrote on miracles and science, how, in the modern age, we should look at stories like the resurrection and interpret them as myths, and look at really an existential interpretation where it's about us making decisions here and now, making a leap of faith here and now, using these stories to help us, rather than being about objective truth. Paul Tillich, of course, tries to redefine God in a different way, the ground of being, or being itself, rather than some being that could be proven or disproven. He thinks this makes more space for human freedom, so a redefinition of the idea of God, certainly influenced by Kierkegaard's ideas, I think. Sartre, we've seen in the 20th century, Existentialism, Humanism, his famous lecture, and Being and Nothingness. And lastly, Emmanuel Levinas. Levinas is interesting because he's a real critic of Kierkegaard. He talks about Kierkegaardian violence, how the idea of Abraham going beyond or transcending the ethical sphere leads to isolation and fundamentally violence and passion. And that's what he sees as being very dangerous. He says this is a bit like Nietzsche, really, and amoralism, or a lack of morality that we get if we follow Kierkegaard's approach to philosophy. So Levinas presents us a slightly critical view of Kierkegaard. So there you go, some philosophers that some of them on the same side of Kierkegaard and Sartre, some of them against, but will help you to give a better idea of where they all fit in.